Today on the Power to Pivot podcast, we are talking about giant talking crab with author Alex Kingsley. Alex, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for asking. Your debut novel just released. Tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the first novel that I have out in the world. It is the fourth novel that I've written. So it's been through a long journey. I started writing it in 2021, and now here we are. The elevator pitch for it is that it's a future where giant crab monsters rule the earth, and this trans boy gets lost in the desert and he has to befriend the creatures to survive.
How did you come up with this concept?
So I kind of always wanted to write a novel about crabs, which I know is a really specific thing. But when I was in seventh grade, I went through this huge, like, classic sci-fi phase. When I was in fifth grade, I had read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I was like, oh my God, sci-fi is like my genre. I love this. I need to read it. So then when I was in seventh grade, I was reading a bunch of H.G. Wells, and I read The Time Machine. And I was kind of like, on the time machine because I was like, okay, he spends this whole time like with the humanoids in the future. That's kind of boring. And then at the very end of the time machine, he goes too far in the future and there's giant crabs. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Why, why did we spend the whole book with those guys when we could have spent the whole book with the way cooler giant crabs? Like, why do we? And then he just goes back to the Victorian era. And I was like, whoa, what? You're going back to the past and you could have hung out with the giant crabs? Like, what? So I was upset that it wasn't a novel about giant crabs. So I decided I would write a novel about giant crabs. That was in seventh grade. So I waited for a bit, but it's kind of always been percolating in my mind. And then carcinization became a really big meme. And if for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of carcinization, it is the evolutionary theory that everything evolves into crab, that crab is God's perfect creature, that that's what we're all destined for thousands of years down the line, because crabs have evolved separately from different animals like tons and tons of times. A bunch of different species ended up becoming crabs. So there's this theory that like that's what we're all destined for. And I was like, oh, it would be really fun to play with that. Like I'm the kind of person where I love a good science fun fact, but I do not study science. I am much more of a humanities person. So I was like, why don't I take this kernel of real science and have fun with it and play around with it and be like, okay, cool. So what would happen if a Komodo dragon evolved crab qualities? What would that look like? What would humans call that creature? All of this stuff that just was really exciting for me, imagination wise. And then I kind of went crazy with it.
I love that. Oh my gosh, for so many reasons. I never actually heard the term carcinization. Say it again, please.
Carcinization.
Carcinization. I've never actually heard that term before, so I'm fascinated, and now I want to learn more. Because I myself am not. I wouldn't consider myself super sciencey either. I'm more like the humanities side, but that's kind of fascinating to me. Like when I think about just they have sort of a different origin story than we do. Um, but I also appreciate the fact that you found this story like from reading and you're like, why would you want to hang out with humans when you can hang out with crabs? Like that's just it's interesting to me because there is a story there or there could be, and you were so open to the possibility of playing with it, and now here you are. I also appreciate and love the fact that you were, seventh grade and you're like, I'm going to write a novel about this someday. And here you are.
Well, I ever since I was very little, I knew that I wanted to write novels. Like that was just, I have always been really fascinated by stories and storytelling. Like I was discussing this at a book event earlier. Ever since I was very, very little, my ritual for going to bed every night was I would come up with stories. And like the earliest ones I can remember, I was a very, very young child, like 5 years old. So they weren't good stories, and they usually involved like characters from pre-existing media that I really liked. But I'd still be like, what if I put them in a situation? And then when I got older and started to make my own characters, which was probably around like middle school, I would do the same thing, but with my own characters. Were those characters good? Were those stories good? No, because I was in middle school. But like this fascination and excitement around making my own stories and taking characters and dropping them in a situation and just like seeing what happens has always been just like a comfort for me, like something that I do naturally. So I was like, well, why don't I just start writing it down? Because if I find these stories exciting and fun and cool, probably someone else in the world will. And the way I see it, if there is a single other person in the world who likes the story that I'm telling, then it's worth telling. And a lot of books have inspired me to write books. Like, I find that a lot of things that I write are sort of love letters to the book or the piece of media or whatever that came before it, that I consumed it and I was like, ooh, I love what this is doing. I want to write my version of it. Like it's going to be distinct. It's going to have all of the things that, make me me, but it is my love letter to this piece of media that inspired it. Like the first piece of writing that I ever put out in the world was my sci-fi comedy podcast called The Stench of Adventure. It is an audio drama. And it is so, so obviously my love letter to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was the thing that made me want to write sci-fi to begin with.
Oh my God, I love this for so many reasons. You're like, you've taken these classics, right? These pieces of literature that have been around for so long, and you're like romanticizing them in a way. And I just appreciate, I love language, I love literature, I love books, and I feel like these are pieces of history that are important and relevant. And the fact that you're taking them and are inspired by them and are sort of making your own, you know, story to almost like continue on that story in a way. Um, I love that. I think that's beautiful, actually, and poetic, and just like, I don't know, I get a very comforting feeling from that, actually.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to hear that.
Well, because I think it's really easy, like, I don't know, a lot of people, I almost feel like, or I guess I get worried that reading and literature takes a backseat today. And language and stories, like, this is how we evolve, this is how we communicate, this is how we relate to one another. I guess it's one way. um and I think books like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that's been around for however many years, it's an interesting read. It opens your mind to different possibilities. Like, I think those are important pieces of our humanity, and it's really easy to tune that out with all the other stuff of the world today. So I really love that you are so inspired by it and want to continue that on. I
Yeah.
do have to ask you,
Yeah, go
though,
ahead. Mhm.
this is your fourth novel written. Where are one, two, and three?
Uh, 1, 2, and 3 are locked away where no one will ever read them.
Oh.
And I think most novelists will tell you that like your first novel is not good. Uh, your second novel is usually also not good, and I would go so far to say that your third novel is also not good. This is not. I've heard people say that like this scares them. They're like, okay, well, why would I even start writing a novel if it's not even going to be any good? And then the next one's not going to be any good, you know? But I actually think it's quite freeing. And I think that that knowledge was what allowed me to get started in the first place, because the first one didn't have to be good. You know, I mean, when I wrote it, I was 19 when I wrote my first novel. And I did it as part of National Novel Writing Month, which now I have moved away from participating in due to a lot of things. But I used it as motivation to get myself to write my first novel. And I was really excited about it at the time. And I did think that I was going to kind of pursue publication for it. And then the more I thought about it, and you know, I was editing and revising and all of that, and I was like, I'm not that excited about this one. Like, I'm glad I did it. I proved to myself that I could write a novel. This one was like I was saying that everything that I write is kind of like a love letter to what I read before it. This was very obviously like my version of Good Omens. It was about a guardian angel that is a terrible guardian angel and keeps getting their charges killed, who, as punishment, has to guard a teenage girl, the most dangerous demographic for a guardian angel.
Right.
It was a fun concept, but you know, it was a first novel. And then the next two, I actually wrote one and I liked it so much, I stuck with this one for a while and I wrote a sequel to it. And I started writing the third one. I got like, I don't know, maybe 50,000 words into the third one. And then the same thing happened. I was like, I really liked the story when I was writing it, but now that I'm looking back on it, now that I'm trying to make it work, there's just too much here that's not working. I would rather work on something else than work on this. And I think that is the indication for me of when a story is where I should be putting my energy is, am I excited to rewrite and edit and make it what it wants to be? Or am I more excited to do something else? And if I'm more excited to do something else, that probably means that that story was like really good practice. And also the themes and the characters and, you know, all of the things that went into making that story, they're gonna come out again. Like nothing that you write is ever dead. You know what I mean? Like even if you write a story and no one ever sees it, like the only person who read my first novel was my dad, and no one else is ever going to see it. But like the things that were in it, the concepts and the dynamics, all of the things that I was excited to write, they're still very core to who I am. So they're gonna come out again, and they have come out again.
That's important for a lot of reasons. Like you could have sat there with the first one or even the second or third and said, I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep pushing. Nope, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And like continue to put your energy and time and effort into something that you really did not have that much excitement for at the time. And I think it's an important message. Like it can just be practice. It can be just playing with ideas. It doesn't have to turn into a published novel yet. But like you said, like that doesn't mean that the ideas aren't useful, aren't things that can be placed in another story that will excite you down the line. But I think it can get really easy for us to sit and go, nope, I got to publish. I want to publish. I want to be a published author. And so I'm just going to force this out. But ultimately, like, I know for me, I couldn't, when I was writing my books, I couldn't write when I wasn't excited and inspired. I think that comes through in the readership as well. Like, I think that sort of translates the page, because if you're not that excited or inspired by the idea, how much energy are you actually putting into this piece of work? It's great that you can sort of just set them aside and say, okay, maybe I'll pull something from this someday.
Yeah, and I think that was a really difficult skill for me to learn. because I feel like the first step when you are like, okay, I want to be a writer, I want to write, is getting yourself to commit to it and to do the thing. And it takes so much emotional effort to say, okay, I am writing this novel now. I'm doing it. So the next kind of level is to be like, I'm moving on. Like, I'm not going to pursue this one. It was worth it. I think that any writing is worth it. But it took another wave of emotional effort to be able to be like, yeah, I wrote it and I'm glad I did, but I'm letting go. And I just had to do that this year and it was still really hard and I've been doing it for years, but like I got 30,000 words into a cyberpunk novel and I was like, I'm not feeling it. I'm just not excited about it. It's becoming a chore. And I had another novel that I really wanted to write. And I was like, why sit on this idea that I'm super excited about and force myself to write a story that I'm just not feeling anymore? And so I set it aside, and I'm sure stuff from it is going to come back. But setting it aside was like a hard decision to make.
Mm-hmm. Because I feel, I've said this before, but you've still invested. It's like this relationship with your writing. You've
Yeah.
invested the energy and the time, right? But it's you're serving up a piece of your soul for the on a platter for the world to see when you write and publish anything, whether it's work or a piece of literature. And so I think it is like you're breaking up with a piece of who you are because you did create this. To be able to let it go and put it aside, and it takes some, adjustment.
Yeah. And like I often feel like, and I think many authors feel this way, like I have a personal relationship with the characters. Like I know these guys. These are my buddies. And yes, I do awful, cruel things to my buddies, my fictional buddies, not my real life buddies. I would
That's
never, put my real life buddies in the horrible, gut-wrenching situations that I put my fictional buddies into. But I often feel like I owe them things. And the reality is, I don't. Like, it sucks to be able to say to this character, hey, I like you a lot. It's not working. I'm going to move on. It's not you, it's me. But I, sometimes that's what you got to do. And oftentimes they'll come back. That I ended up in a piece that I wrote and finished and I am excited about and will be out in the world. I brought back one of my original characters from seventh grade. I was like, you know what, girl, it's your time to shine. This is the perfect story for you. And obviously I developed her and made her more of a person than she was when I was in seventh grade, because in seventh grade, I still didn't know how to write characters yet. But I never expected that these old ideas were ever going to resurface. But I was like, who fits in this world that I'm making? Actually, I already have some. I know someone who fits the bill. So
so cool.
yeah,
You're like a character matchmaker.
it feels that way sometimes.
That's so cool. Okay, so Empress of Dust. Where can people find it?
Everywhere. It's on Amazon. You can get it at Barnes& and Noble. You can go to your independent bookstore and ask them to order it. In fact, you probably should do that, support local business. And then maybe they'll be like, oh, maybe we should carry this book. And then they will. It's far and wide.
Awesome. And where can people connect with you if they have questions or really are interested in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I am always really excited when people want to connect with me. So please do if you're interested. My website is alexkingsley.org, but I also have a link tree. I don't remember the URL, but if you just Google Alex Kingsley link tree, it'll be there. And that has like, every single place on the internet that you could possibly find something related to me, including like my mushroom Instagram page. Like it's got everything.
Awesome. Make sure that it links to the book and your website and Linktree, and I'll get into the show notes. This way people can connect with you, and definitely want everyone to pick up a copy of Empress of Dust. Um, How did you come up with the title?
The title was a very long process.
It's difficult to write a title for the book, right?
Yeah. And so many of my titles have changed over time. So the original title for this, well, okay, the original title was originally this was going to be a short story. It ended up being uh, the draft that I sent out to, that I pitched was 140,000 words. We ended up cutting it down to 130,000 words. So, like, definitely not a short story. But the original title of the short story was Harvard Bites the Bullet, because I knew right from the beginning that I just felt like the protagonist was named Harvard. And then as I developed the story, I came up with the justification for that these desert scavengers need code names because they can die so easily. They don't want to get attached to each other. So they have this tradition where they have the names of ancient brands. So the group of scavengers that Harvard is with, their brand name is the Ivies, and their individual brand names are Yale, Columbia, Princeton, and Harvard. And that is our main cast of characters. All of this is set up to say that the original title, once it became a novel, was The Ivies and the Empress. And the Empress, evidently, that stayed because the Empress, who I won't give any details about here because that's a bit of a spoiler for the book, but there is an Empress who is relevant. But I realized that without the context, the Ivies sounded too fantasy. It was not giving the correct genre. So I didn't want people to start reading with certain expectations that were not going to be fulfilled. The desert, the place where all of the crab creatures, the desert walkers live, is called the Dusts. So I was like, okay, why don't I pull that in? That's kind of a more of a sci-fi touchstone. It's evoking Dune, stuff like that. I'm not trying to say that I wrote the next Dune. Please do not think that's what I'm saying. But, it is a touchstone. So I put those pieces together and landed on Empress of Dust, not only because, I mean, you're going to meet the Empress of Dust if you read the book, but also because I felt like it was signaling the right energy. So a lot more thought went into the title than you would think. I have a huge document of potential titles that I brainstormed, and I was, I have run this writers group, and I was like sending them out to the writers group and having everyone vote, and like I was asking my parents, like it was a huge thing, and this is what we landed on.
It's a difficult task. You've written this piece, like, and you literally have to sum up the entire book in very few words.
Yeah, and the title does so much heavy lifting because it's not just, what would I call this? What do I think sums this up? It's the first thing that anyone is going to know about the book. And a lot of times, you know, people do judge a book by its cover, but before they judge it by its cover, they're probably going to judge it by its title, which they may hear before they even see the cover. So it's making sure that people have at least a sense of what they're getting into. Because I have definitely read books where the title led me to believe it was one thing and then it was another, and I was disappointed. And I don't want that to be the case for anyone. I don't want anyone to go into the story thinking it's going to be one thing and then be upset that it wasn't that.
Yeah. That's actually a really good call out. Like, it's a matter of making sure your readers aren't disappointed because they have a different sense of what they're actually getting. It's a good point because I know I've read stories where I've thought it's one thing and it was not.
Yeah. I had someone in my writers group tell me that, and this is when I knew I had to pick a new title, that when they heard The Ivies and the Empress without context, it sounded like a high school story about a popular girl who's the captain of the volleyball team, who is the empress of her school trying to get into the Ivy League colleges. And I was like, well, that's definitely not what this book is about.
Wow, that's great feedback though. Would you recommend groups for for others out there who are trying to capture their first novel, maybe, or like,
Do you say do I recommend writers groups?
yes.
Oh, absolutely. A writers group is so useful. And it is another thing actually that takes practice, learning how to collaborate with other writers, how to critique other writers, and how to take feedback from other writers. So, and I think doing all of those things makes you a better writer. So it is incredibly useful, but it is also a learning process. That's like my warning to other writers. But like, if you want to be in a writers group, go for it. I started this group specifically because my sister was in a writers group, and I was like, how did you find that? And she was like, oh, you can just make it. And so I was like, cool, I'm going to do that. And I just made it and started inviting people. And then the people I invited started inviting people. And now we've got a really solid group. We've been running for 4 years, which is exciting. And we're still meeting regularly, critiquing people's work. And I think I've learned a ton about how to read other people's work, how to give actionable feedback without telling them, well, this is how I think you should fix your story. Being able to point out, like, here's the things that are working, here's the things that are not. And similarly, be able to like take it without being emotionally hurt when someone is like, hey, this aspect of your story is not working. Because this novel, my writers group, they saw it from start to finish. My first 3 novels, I wrote them on my own. No one else had any input. I think it is huge. And I say this in the acknowledgments of Empress, like it would not be where it is today were it not for the Silent Note Takers Writers Collective. Like they saw it at chapter 1 when I was like, I don't know where this is going, but I'm excited about it. And they gave me feedback all the way through that really shaped what it ended up being. So I owe so much to them.
That's awesome. And again, to your point, like, it's not easy at first to get the feedback, but it's important to know that it's not personal. It is when it's with the right audience, and I think this is to the note of a writers group, because that is the intended purpose of what you're doing in that, with that circle, right? Like, it's there to help support you in your writing, and that helps, right? It's different from just giving it to someone and saying, tell me what you think, because they will. And I think it's a different level of feedback, because it's very direct and like specific to what you need to develop this story.
But I also do recommend when you're starting a writers group, uh, to start with people that you do know and trust their artistic judgment, trust them as collaborators, probably people that have the same tastes as you, that are looking for the same things in a piece of writing as you are. Because I think what makes this writers group work well is we started being like, we're all looking for the same thing. We all like broadly the same type of book, and we're all kind of writing similar types of book. That's not to say that everyone is writing exactly the same thing, but if someone who, wrote exclusively romance, contemporary romance, joined this writers group, they probably wouldn't find what they were looking for, and we would probably not know how to give really great feedback because we are so heavily a speculative fiction group. And setting expectations when it comes to feedback, I think, is really important. And this is another skill that I learned. I wrote my first novel. I did not understand that feedback is different from different people, and that someone who has a lot of experience with writing is going to give you a lot of like craft level feedback, and someone who does not, their opinion is going to be incredibly valuable, because most people who are reading your work are probably not going to be people who have studied writing and can give you, the specific jargony feedback. But those are the people who are going to be reading it. So their impressions matter. But they're not going to use all the special language, and they're going to be honest with you and sometimes hurt you. So I've found that having different relationships with your different readers, like some writers who are super seasoned, I was in this other writers group when I was living in Madrid for a bit. I was in I think it's just called the Madrid writers group. And this one is open. Like literally, if you live in Madrid and you want to join an English language writers group, like you just show up at this group. This one's completely open. And the guy who runs it like has written 70 novels, something crazy like that. And he was like, yeah, I only ever get feedback from people who I know are going to be honest with me and critique me. And, I don't need any positive feedback. Like, I just want to know what's wrong and I'll fix it. And I'm like, okay, I'm not at 70 yet. So I want some readers who are going to read it and just be like, yeah, good job. I also want the people who are going to, my writers group who are going to be like, yeah, this is working. This is not, you need to fix it. Who are going to tell me the title sounds like it's about a high school girl. Like I do need that, and that's important, but I'm still going to give it to my partner, and I'm still going to have my partner read it. My partner is not a fiction person at all. In fact, the only fiction books that he reads are mine. But I still want to hear his impressions, and we have an understanding. We, have set the expectations for what kinds of feedback I want from him. Like when I wrote my first novel, I showed him the very beginning, and like I said, it was bad. It was not a good novel. Like I was learning, but he didn't know how to give feedback, and he didn't know like what the granular stuff about, all of the jargony stuff that I even didn't know at the time. So he was just kind of like, yeah, I don't like it. Which is like not a great thing to hear from your partner. And that's how we realized, okay, we need to actually set some, not rules necessary, but like an understanding of what I want from you when it comes to feedback versus a very different set of expectations that comes to my writers group.
You do have to sort of almost set that expectation and understanding of what exactly you're looking for. Otherwise, you will get everything under the sun and not necessarily something that would be helpful in terms of story development and plot line. But I do agree. I think it's valid to get both the pros and the cons. Like it's just as important to know what's working as well as what is not. So it doesn't specifically just need to be negative. Alex,
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming on today and sharing everything. This was such a fun conversation. Empress of Dust, guys, make sure you pick it up. Oh, before we wrap up, the podcast. You mentioned you had
Yes.
doing the podcast.
Oh, I still have it. It's wrapping up. So the last season is coming out soon in the near future. But yeah, the podcast is The Stench of Adventure. It's a sci-fi comedy audio drama. So if that's your thing, absolutely check it out. I lucked out with some incredible voice actors who are willing to do this ridiculous show. So it's been so much fun to make, and I hope it's fun to listen to.
Alex Kingsley, thank you so much for joining us today on the Power to Pivot podcast. Guys, remember, pick up Empress of Dust everywhere great books are sold, and listen to the podcast. We'll drop links to the show notes. Connect with Alex, and we'll talk with you soon. Alex, you need to make sure to come back and let us know when the next book comes out.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to. I've had a great time. Thank you so much for having me on, and I would be thrilled to come back and talk about the next thing.